Uh, Lindsey is a designer and artist currently living in Garrison, Texas, and attending SFA with a focus in studio arts drawing. Graduated from Savannah College of Art and Design in 2009 with a BFA in fashion. She said she considers art and design two branches of the same tree and does not discriminate when it comes to art media. She has a background in pattern making and drafting in the apparel industry and was featured on season 14 of Lifetime TV's Project Runway. I'm sure you all know her better than I do even, but I'm so impressed with her curriculum vitae, which is very steeped in the fashion world, but also in education. She has taught high school in Elgin, Texas, and has done internships in New York. She owns her own company where she personally produces 200 plus pieces of women's wear by hand per year, which is no small feat. That's a big task. So I know her as a very, very hard worker. Her work ethic is stellar, and it's backed up by a very keen intellect. You know, we've had some really great conversations about her work. My first interaction with Lindsey came when, as part of our seminar class last semester, she asked me to comment on how she was mounting her work on panels, and I gave her just this much advice and thought I'd given that same amount of advice to other students before, and they didn't run with it. And she came back about a week later saying, "Yeah, I made it work." And I thought, oh, right, I forgot about that. Look, you're successful. And I knew from that moment on it was going to be a pretty smooth road. We want to make sure that we give a special welcome to Lindsey's family here in the audience. Where are you? Yeah, we got parents-in-law and
he's hiding in the corner.
no, he's on the bike ride.
Yeah.
My eyes aren't as good as they used to be, but we're glad to have you here. So I'm not going to talk anymore. We'll go ahead and give Lindsey the floor. When we're done, we'll have a time for everybody to ask questions, particularly those who are visiting, after which our tradition is to excuse visitors, friends, and then we remain as faculty to continue questions. So I'll remind you of that when we get to that point. Lindsey?
Thank you, Neil. I so appreciate every one of you being here today. It really means a lot to me. And more specifically, I want to thank and give a huge thank you to my thesis committee, Neil Cox, Lauren Selden, Piera Finci, and Dr. Joey Bray, not only for your input and your guidance throughout this process, but for your friendship and for your mentorship in the time that I've been with the university. I will be forever grateful for that. So Neil told you a little bit about my background, and I'm just going to tell you a hair more because I feel like it's important for you to understand in order to understand the current body of work that I have. So again, my background is in fashion, more specifically in flat patterning and in technical design. And I both worked in New York and in Austin. This is when I was running my own line, which sold in multiple retail locations and online. And my focus in design is typically leaned towards oversized shapes and large blocks of color, and the idea of being deceptively comfortable when worn. In 2015, I was on Project Runway. I am an introvert, so it was pretty brutal, but it was really cool because it opened several doors for me in my career, including helping to redesign the Texas State Judges Robe for women, as well as being asked to speak at TEDx Youth. So pretty naturally, I assumed that my career would continue in this direction. And I started graduate school with a goal to earn my MFA in 2018 in a fashion program at another university. But I just didn't feel the kind of joy or drive that I assumed would go along with navigating a fashion degree. And so that, coupled with a little pandemic-based inspiration, led me to SFA. And thank you for accepting me here. Historically, in order for me to feel comfortable working within a new space, I have to get really comfortable with the media. And so I spent the first while that I was here really just kind of swimming in that, trying to figure out what it was that I wanted to say by the time that I left. So I kind of dug in and took inventory on what it was I found fulfilling about the other aspects of my life, with the goal to bring those principles into my artwork. And my husband and I renovate houses outside of Austin, and the ones we choose are pretty gross. They're really gross, actually, but there is a feeling of home, like a hidden experience underneath the grime. And for me, it's primarily about what's gained in the process of working with media that's outside of traditional art and design media, as well as executing high levels of craft. And it's the same in the garden, only the garden reciprocates the care that I give it in a much more active way. There's an illusion of control when you curate a garden. It's about its shape and color and its scale and order, and a sense of anticipation for what will and won't survive the elements. It's process heavy, and the outcomes are fleeting. And if it's not documented at the peak of its time, it's as if it never happened. So my relationship with gardening has little to do with tangible outcomes. It is about emotional sustenance and the purging of anxious energy, and I consider it the antidote to overstimulation. So through my obvious love of the garden, as well as a prompt from Westberg, I came into my current body of work. And it started with this exploration back in November. I wanted to do this in a way, and by this I mean bring the whole thing into my work, that didn't feel like my grandparents' bathroom version of floral art, right? No lilies and watercolor for me. So in this exploration, I collected the dead and dying flower heads from around my property and physically pressed them into drawing paper to kind of see what would develop. And on the left, you have the result of that exploration, which took about a month to create. And while it was interesting, it was by no means soul-shaking. So I decided to break it down into what I call micro compositions and kind of play with them in the digital space to see what could come out of it. And that resulted in a lot of these. They're really just a quick attempt to find the right colorway and potential of this piece. And this was the final result. And from here, my brain kind of opened up to the contemporary potential of bringing my skills and creativity together underneath botanical content. I also documented the waste of that previous work in varied compositions, and the artifact aspect felt like something that I could hold on to, as opposed to something more experimental. End of life cycles and these flashes of time are pretty ingrained in my renovation and gardening practices, but they're also a huge part of my fashion background. So I took this spent plant material and I searched for a way to translate it onto paper to make it feel the way that it felt in my mind. And around this time, I had begun digging deeper into Jim Dine's work. And I love the way that Dine uses negative space and shadow to kind of reveal his content. And I also appreciate the variety that he presents. A lot of his works throughout his career could come from multiple artists, but there's typically some balance of clean lines and total mush and suggested movement. And so those ideas led me to a larger scale and a lot of charcoal. On the far right, you have the first of what is now many large-scale charcoal drawings. I've included the color photo because I wanted to give you an honest look at how these large drawings start out. I just shoot them on my kitchen countertop. I drop them into Photoshop, heavily edit them digitally, and they end up being a black and white image, which is what you can see in the center. They're then projected and drawn in charcoal. And I chose charcoal, even though it's extremely fickle, because it felt like an appropriate medium for two reasons, at least main ones. One, it is essentially dead plant material, right? But two, when given the right amount of time and attention and patience, you can develop really beautiful moments of depth. And so this led to a series of non-objective drawings that really attempt to explore the mystical nature of spending time with the land. And I've been investigating, zooming in and out of these drawings, and kind of discovering that the process and the finished work are essentially one and the same, which is something quite parallel to behaviors that we express in nature. And I've amassed like a visual glossary of compositions for potential future drawings. And without question, I will continue this path of my work. But I'm also considering exploring more uses for plant material as art material, and working through how to visually document the positive feelings that I associate with my gardening practices. And these feelings are incredibly difficult to describe, even in words. They're elusive, especially because I'm attempting to describe a moment visually once I am outside of it. So this spring, I planted specific flower varieties like amaranth and zinnia, safflower and marigolds for their potential use in my work. I'm in it for the long game. I don't know if you can tell. I grow marigolds every year, but I chose this variety in hopes that it would be dramatic when pressed. And the red and yellow stain super differently, and they're totally lovely when they're moved to black and white. And each pressing has a positive and a negative, as they're sandwiched between two sheets of paper. So the left image includes the plant remnants, like the petals themselves and the seeds. And then the right is just the imprint of those flower stains. Most recent of my explorations is in anthotypes. Amanda Breitbach brought them to my attention just before the summer. And anthotypes involve using photosensitive material, obstruction, and UV light to produce an image over time. It felt right to bring these into the greenhouse. The heat and humidity and consistent access to undisturbed light has definitely aided in the imagery developing. But letting them bake in the greenhouse is also a way for the studio to become more of a part of the experience that's being documented and transformed on paper. The majority of projects that I take on call for a tremendous amount of time and attention to detail, but anthotypes are like the crock pot of art making. So it's been really lovely for me to be able to explore in this way. Eventually, I got to the point where I felt like I needed to kind of confront the ghost of my 3D past. And so alongside gardening, curating outdoor experiences to support varied visual experiences is something that I kind of obsess about. And essentially the idea ties itself to land art. But generally I believe that your attitude can shift based on manufactured aesthetic cues, especially in natural settings. And I've seen similar ideas within Richard Long's work. I especially appreciate his later works, which are in mud and pigments. And in these later works, he integrates art into structures, as opposed to disrupting the natural order of established landscapes. So I searched for additional inspiration, and I wanted to find something that would help me feel connected to or informed by the outdoors when viewed from inside. So I integrated the projections and the dyeing with plant extracts and exposure to light, and created something to the effect of a silent wind chime, which I can barely see from my kitchen window. And these are drawn in London. So they've been aging in the pasture for about 3 months now, enduring mostly sun and a fairly intense amount of wind. But as they age, they step further away from like the pristine paper versions of their siblings. For a while, I thought about whether to add more vibrant color to these works, like across the board. And around the time I finished the first round of those big charcoal drawings, I went and saw the Cy Twombly gallery at the Manil in Houston. And Twombly's orbs and kind of nests of color really resonate with me, so I wanted to try playing with some of his more garish reds and Pepto pinks and like deeper kind of mushy blacks. And through that inspiration, I also made a plan to push further in exploring bolder and more diverse mark making. The change in marks feels more significant than the addition of color to me. And by this point, I've definitely accepted that just because the work is intertwined with the garden does not mean it's owed a floral color palette. Because a lot of this series is in black and white. On the right here, you have a detail. It takes roughly a jillion scumbles to make one of these, and they are built through pressure and time and control, and they are reliant on the tooth of the paper. And the process is pretty hypnotic. And often I walk back from the paper to make sure that the range is speaking to, value-wise, what I want it to. And they're really difficult to understand up close, primarily because I'm usually drawing them in the dark for long periods of time. But with these works, the previous slide and this one, I feel like I finally really found my footing with the viewer. And I think that it's because of the scale and also because of that buildup of marks that I've seen viewers in a gallery space do that same sort of slow dance, walking into and out of these drawings, as if that investigation is revealing something more than what they are. I'm sure you've noticed by now, the bulk of my work speaks to something meditative. But there were moments that I wanted to add something with more energy. And this, for me, even as a digital image before it was built out, feels anxious, as I do fairly consistently, so it felt appropriate. And I sank deeper into the digital process for this work, and I built it out of multiple compositions and multiple layers, and then I laid down the medium on the paper in multiple layers, and it's given it almost these seemingly infinite small moments to discover. Early in the series, I was obsessively leaning into the vertical. Like, no matter how the orientation was meant in conception, verticality would take over by the time they were on display. Which is interesting, as this entire collection is about the landscape, and they are remotely observational. But this work, coupled with an Alora and Quesadilla exhibition, sparked the need to consider a larger picture plane that was firmly on the horizon. Which led me to this, which is a triptych. It's 48 by 144. And moving towards such a scale, it's not meant to impose. And it's really not even meant to impress. Like, it's to envelop and immerse, and to pull the viewer into a simulated emotional state. Because hopefully it's impossible to ignore. And I plan to keep exploring new paths to further develop my visual language and further figure out how to communicate these feelings that I feel to the viewer. But for the present, many of the pieces that you've seen today will be on display at the Reevely Gallery at the Cole Art Center from November 1st to the 18th. I genuinely appreciate your time, not only in this room, but for the conversations and just the general pleasantries that we've had for the past year and a half. So thank you. And I'm open to questions.
So I was wondering if you had thought much about the juxtaposition between the fact that, like, you create these works mainly in the dark.
Yes.
And you're creating works that are, like, from the garden, so, like, they need the light. Have you thought about that juxtaposition at all?
You know, Kaylin, by this point I feel like I've overthought a little bit of everything. And I'm totally with you. And if there was a world where I could project and have the lights on, I would be living in that world, I promise you. But I do love the comparison, for sure. And also, hi, thank you for coming.
What would you say the biggest obstacle in this whole process would be?
The biggest obstacle? Well, I've hit a few of them. I mean, I think that the number one thing I had to do was kind of get out of my own way and just make as much and make as many mistakes so that I could end up with some really beautiful finished work in the end. Physically, the biggest obstacle is trying to tote around these gigantic drawings. I'm not very good at it. But yeah, I think it's the mental aspect. And once you break through that, you can power through and make as much work as possible.
Do you have any other questions from students, family, friends?
I'll ask a brief one. Whenever you're creating your works and coming up with your miniature compositions, do you find that those in a smaller form still elicit the same kind of like calmness or emotions that you're trying to create? Or when you create them larger, do you feel like you realize new emotions that can be paired with them?
Well, in general, I feel like I should say, oh, they become this much grander thing when they're bigger. But really, there is a moment of just kind of like, ooh, that happens when they're small, of like, you could really be something, and now it's up to me to figure out how to make that happen. But there is that initial spark when they're tiny, for sure. Yeah. Yes?
Do you prefer working on the linen with the with the charcoal, or do you prefer the paper or the digital?
So working on fabric with dry media is a little bit tricky. It's a lot dirtier, and the surface of my wall in that room definitely proves it. I personally prefer, I've found this really magical combination of a specific paper that I love and dry media, and they work really magically together. So working on linen, I had a few new obstacles, especially because I was dyeing them in between each drawing. So I would put them in the vat, and when they came out, they were kind of mushy and weirder, and then I would dig back in and put details into it and then wash some of that detail out. So it was a back and forth process. It was just a really different experience. But on the day-to-day, I would definitely stick to paper. Yeah.
Okay, we'll excuse the general public.
Arrivederci studenti. Ciao, ciao studenti.
Thanks for coming. Cool.
Sure how you